good morning, and thank you for joining us today for this exploratory workshop on the role of school professionals in preventing social polarization and radicalization to violence. My name is Audrey Monette, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Director of Projects and Research for the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. On behalf of the entire team here at CMNCP, I do want to say how excited and grateful we are to see such a broad and diverse group of frontline workers and school professionals and researchers come together today to discuss this topic that's important and I think very timely as well. Bonjour tout le monde, merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui pour cet atelier exploratoire sur le rôle des professionnels scolaires dans la prévention de la polarisation sociale et de la radicalisation menant à la violence. Mon nom est Audrey Monette, j'utilise le pronom « elle » et je suis la directrice des projets et de la recherche pour le réseau municipal canadien en prévention de la criminalité. Au nom de toute l'équipe, je veux vous dire à quel point on est heureux et reconnaissant de voir tous ces professionnels scolaires, les travailleurs de première ligne, puis des chercheurs aussi, réunis aujourd'hui pour discuter de ce sujet-là qui nous importe beaucoup puis qui est très d'actualité également. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that I am joining you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, colonially known as Gatineau, Quebec. I do acknowledge the land as a small act of reconciliation to honor the land and Indigenous heritage and history.
This project is funded by the Government of Canada through the Community Resilience Fund. And at this time, I'd like to welcome David Clement from the Canada Centre to provide some opening remarks from our funders. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Audrey, for giving me the opportunity to provide opening remarks on behalf of Public Safety Canada, on behalf of the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence. And I would like to thank you, Audrey and Katie, and your team at the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention in your efforts to organizing this fantastic exploratory workshop on school-based prevention in the context of social polarization and violent radicalization. Also, I would like to acknowledge the land that Public Safety Canada headquarters and the Canada Centre, as well as myself, are located on, which is the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and their culture and presence has nurtured and continues to nurture this land. I would also like to take a moment and speak to the horrific and recent attack at the Dar al-Tawhid Islamic Center in Mississauga, Ontario, during which many members of the Muslim community got injured during dawn prayer. The police has reported that multiple charges are being laid in what is believed to be a hate-motivated crime. Our thoughts are especially with the Mississauga Muslim community today. Let me share a few words about the Canada Centre and our role and approach to preventing and countering radicalization to violence. Since its inception in 2017, the Canada Centre coordinates the Government of Canada's efforts to counter radicalization to violence with an emphasis on prevention and intervention. We take a broad, interdisciplinary, and non-securitized approach to countering radicalization to violence. Our approach is informed by fields such as community safety and well-being, social work, crime prevention, and the public health model. With this approach in mind, we acknowledge that pathways of radicalization to violence are multifaceted phenomena, driven by a patchwork of risk factors and vulnerabilities that are unique to the individual case. Radicalization to violence is not driven by any particular background, culture, or religion. Efforts to prevent and counter radicalization to violence and hate must therefore also follow multifaceted, inclusive, person-centered, and bias-sensitive approaches and pedagogies. Through the Community Resilience Fund, the Canada Centre provides financial assistance to support the efforts of researchers, frontline practitioners, and community-based organizations to prevent and counter radicalization to violence in Canada. Today's workshop, which is part of the larger CMNCP project funded through the Community Resilience Fund, focuses on research and the exchange of knowledge to better understand and design school-based approaches to prevent and social polarization, and violent radicalization. Schools have been described as the microcosm of society. Formal and curriculum-based education is complemented by non-formal education and social learning, which is so important in the lives of children and youth. One of the many lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic is the role that schools play in our communities. Schools are a place where values and life skills are developed, shaped, learned, and internalized. School professionals, such as teachers, but also board members, school administrators, school counselors, and social workers, play important roles in the lives of young people and can also play key parts in the prevention of social polarization, hate, and radicalization to violence. Now, preventing polarization and violent radicalization in the school sector is by no means an easy undertaking. It requires, as this workshop will explore today, reflection, learning, and the implementation of actions and values at the individual, community, organizational, and structural level. I wish everyone a wonderful workshop today, a workshop that will enrich our reflection about prevention in the school sector, but also the tools and values and attitudes that are needed to build school and community environments that promote human rights, anti-racism, inclusion, democracy, and social justice. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for providing those opening remarks, and thank you to the Canada Centre for making this project and this workshop possible today. We greatly appreciate it. So before we officially dive into the workshop today, Katie and I are just going to provide a couple of details on the project just to situate everyone, set the stage a little bit on the project. And so the first thing I'll do very quickly is talk a little bit about the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention, or CMNCP for short, and some of the work that we do. So CMNCP is the organization that is working on the current project. And really, we are a membership-based nonprofit organization that serves as a community of practice. So we really focus on supporting communities to prevent and reduce violence. And to do that, we promote an approach that's very much community-led, multi-sectoral, that includes a full range of preventative measures in key sectors. So we can think about education, of course, health and social services, youth services, Indigenous organizations, and many, many more. So violence prevention and community safety in this work are not imagined as a policing issue only, but more so as a collective responsibility that includes a number of multi-sectoral partners coming together to address some of the root causes and risk factors of violence. And so CMNCP members are municipalities from across the country. So we currently represent we have 100 members across the country, both rural and urban, which represents just over 50% of the Canadian population. And I think our smallest community has a population of about 800 people. And our largest is the city of Toronto with over 6 million. So we do try to do, violence prevention efforts that resonate in different contexts and different settings. So the project that we are working on currently is called Investigating the Role of School Professionals in the Prevention of Social Polarization and Radicalization to Violence. So as we mentioned, it's a 2-year project funded by the Community Resilience Fund, and the project started in April of 2021. So we're just wrapping up year 1 here. And the idea for this project really came up because we realized that the research on preventing social polarization and violent radicalization often focuses on kind of the professionals or the organizations that are directly involved in those efforts. So that, that's their direct mandate. But because of our work that focuses on violence prevention through, those multi-sectoral approaches, we wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive into the role of key stakeholders outside of the traditional violence prevention field, such as school professionals, to see, what's the role that they can play in terms of preventing, identifying, and addressing risk factors related to social polarization and radicalization to violence. Quick note here that we did use the term school professionals to encompass a broader group of professionals. So rather than focusing only on teachers, for example, it really broadens the scope a little bit to include additional professionals like social workers or counselors, administrators, people that work, in school boards, to really kind of include all those perspectives and make sure that, we're working with school professionals to identify what some of the gaps are, some of the needs are, and then come up with some general recommendations. And so that's really the key objectives of the project. And I do want to mention that the key partners on this project are Dr. Ghayda Hassan and Dr. Sébastien Brouillet-Alary from CPN-PREV, as well as John McCoy from the Organization for the Prevention of Violence. And I do want to thank them for partnering with us on this project, and to mention that, they've been really instrumental in helping to frame some of the project activities, objectives, and some of the next steps in the project as well. And on that note, I'll hand it over to Katie to talk a little bit about the activities.
Perfect. Thanks, Audrey. So I'm going to go through this real quick because I know we want to get into the keynote presentation. So as Audrey mentioned, we're working on this project, investigating the role of school professionals in the prevention of social polarization and violent radicalization. So as you can see from the screen, there's several different steps in this project. So far, we've completed the preliminary literature review, which is what led us to this workshop, as Audrey just mentioned. And so the information that we collect today, in addition to the lit review data, will support the project going forward and help guide the work that we do with the focus groups and the survey with school professionals. And we will provide a bit more information on that later on if anybody is interested in hearing more about participating in those as well. So just a real quick overview of the findings we've identified thus far. So we reviewed approximately 50 documents for the literature review, about a half of which were academic articles, and others included things like action plans, policy papers, strategies, guides, toolkits, anything like that. So essentially what we identified was three main themes in the academic literature, as you can see on the screen. So the first was educator competence. And what we found was, among the research that had been done relating to this, there does appear to be a lot of variation in training and confidence in their ability to respond to issues like polarization, radicalization within schools. And a lot of them indicated that they would like to see more training to increase this confidence and competence. And then by and large, those who tend to have the highest levels of competence or confidence in their ability to do so tended to be from the United Kingdom, because they have the UK Prevent strategy, which really provides specific guidelines for educators in their role in preventing radicalization in the classroom. So we saw the connection there from this higher level policy to the school level. The literature also identified several barriers for school professionals in addressing or preventing social polarization and radicalization. Again, this was related to sort of a lack of clarity around what is referred to when we talk about radicalization, and a need to really outline what is being referred to, what these definitions include, how to detect these issues, and what is referred to. And again, I think the lack of clarity is what led to another barrier, which was just a lack of confidence in their ability to detect them, and a bit of concern around negative outcomes, so alienation and stigma, for example, if they made an accusation that was incorrect. And then finally, concern over pushback from parents and other people in the community for addressing these issues in the classroom. And then there were also some recommendations identified in the literature. So again, the need to provide safe spaces for meaningful conversations in the classroom, and really leveraging that strong student-teacher bond that has an element of trust there. And the need for administrators to support teachers and school staff in this process and having these conversations. And then also ensuring that these approaches, so the prevention and intervention approaches, range from the elementary to the post-secondary level, recognizing that across those different age groups, there's different aspects or interventions or strategies that can be implemented to prevent or intervene with radicalization or social polarization as well. And then also really trying to avoid the use of surveillance or profiling of single groups or students in the schools to avoid stigmatization and alienation. And then just something else worth noting is we were really looking to see if there was gaps between these higher level policies at the national or international level, for example, and those within schools. And so from reviewing the broader policies and also the in-school strategies, we identified that there did appear to be some disconnect between them. With the exception of primarily the UK Prevent strategy, again, because that strategy has a very specific guideline for school professionals. So it really spoke to the need for not only more information from individuals working at the school level, because a lot of them are conceptual, but the need to draw the connections between those and inform those higher level policies based on the information from the frontline workers as well. So that's a very brief summary of the lit review. But yeah, that's the current state of the project, and that's why we're here today. And with that, I will pass it back over to Audrey to introduce our keynote speakers.
All right, thank you so much for that, Katie. And I will mention too that obviously, you know, this was the very short high-level version, but we did attach in your little pre-workshop package a document that does provide a bit more detail on some of the findings so far in the literature review process for those of you who are interested. And we do look forward to diving into some of the conversations today. And so now that everyone has sort of that background information on the project and the session today, I am super excited to move into our keynote presentation. You may have seen it on the agenda. The keynote presentation is titled Deradicalization, Conceptualizing an Alt-Right Leader's Journey in and Out of Hate. Our keynote speakers today are Dr. Ghayda Hassan, as well as Brad Galloway. Ghayda and Brad, I first want to thank you both so much for being here today. I know it's a tight schedule with events happening simultaneously. So I do want to say a huge thank you for your willingness to be with us today, to share your knowledge, your experience, and your expertise with us. So Dr. Hassan is a clinical psychologist and professor of clinical psychology at UQAM in Montreal. She has a number of research, clinical, and community-based affiliations, both nationally and internationally. She's the director of the Canada Practitioners Network for the Prevention of Radicalization and Extremist Violence. Some of you may know that as CPN-PREV, and is also a UNESCO co-chair on the prevention of violent radicalization. She's a researcher, clinician, and a policy consultant in matter of interventions in the context of violence, so radicalization, family violence, and war more specifically. And our other speaker, Brad Galloway, has been the coordinator at the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism at Ontario Tech University since 2020. He has a wealth of experience from his work in countering and preventing violent extremism and terrorism space, and his more recent work in intervention and case management with NGOs such as Life After Hate. Brad also conducts some consultancy work centered around the EVOLVE program at the Organization for the Prevention of Violence. And for a number of years, Brad was involved with Canadian alt-right groups, initially the Toronto Skinhead Movement, and then later in British Columbia as the national leader of a group called Volksfront. But then he walked away, and today he's going to share with us some insights on his experience and his journey. And Ghayda's going to conceptualize some of the different kind of stages of Brad's experience and provide some insights on potential solutions for prevention and intervention with a focus on the role of school professionals. Brad and Ghayda, what we did is we developed a set of questions to kind of guide the conversation, but I do want to mention that, you know, feel free to kind of take this and run with it really in terms of your experiences. And Brad, maybe what I'll do is I'll start with you with some questions that are more on kind of the earlier stages of your experience. So, you know, we called it kind of the pre-recruitment phase. And so my questions for you are, can you describe any of the challenges that you feel like you faced as a youth / teenager? So, you know, any things that could be considered risk factors as a youth, and maybe speak a little bit to how you think those challenges may have contributed to your recruitment into an extremist group.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we all have different experiences and with our lives, and I think that there are some pretty defining things, but there's also no certain set of things that really equal someone's involvement in these groups. However, I found myself in early teenage years searching for an identity, just like most folks are looking for, is some place to hang their figurative hat on, whether it's sports, whether it's different social groups, things like that. But for me, I had a friend that got killed in a car accident around 12. And over the last couple of years, I've sort of started to think about how that impacted those early years of my teenage, the different challenges in adolescence for me. And I think it mostly impacted me in the sense of giving up on things that were like, construed as the normal situation that I should have been, the normal trajectory that I should have been going on as far as my family had in mind. So it was, living day to day rather than trying to plan ahead, trying all sorts of new things, whether that be drugs, alcohol, high risk behavior, getting in fights, that kind of stuff. And sort of getting involved in, going out late, going to raves, things like that in my early teenagehood, like 13, 14 years old, things like that, kind of led me to meet other people that were involved in street level crime and drug dealing, things like that. So it would send me down this pathway of obviously getting involved in the criminal justice system, which in the 1990s was, I found, looking back on it now, it was a revolving door of, you get one charge and you end up with a whole bunch of administrative charges, and you end up just going back into custody a bunch of times. And while I had like really positive things going on at that time too, I had a girlfriend and I had those things in high school, and those things were still going semi-okay. I was starting to develop some, I guess, real attachments to some pretty more heavily involved people in the street world. So it kind of like, I think that whole, when we go through a big scenario, like somebody close to you, we lose somebody close to us, that becomes a catalyst for, what's to come. And we don't really know what that's going to look like, particularly for youth. And in my case, I only started to really think about this over the last couple of years, about how that affected me as a person, and also how my family responded to that. Like, it was really all about them. It was all about what they were going through, and you should just be able to get over these types of things. So those types of things are very hard to manage as well. When you're a young person, you're not. There's no specific rhythm to parenting, but I think it's definitely informed the way that I do my work, but also as a parent myself, with empathy and trying to have bigger conversations with my children, because it's those times can be really, really influential, and you don't know what those outcomes are going to be. So we want to be there to support young people when they're going through these types of things.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think we're hearing a couple of things float to the top. So kind of that trauma, going through something very difficult as a young person, and then how that kind of leads to some of the things that you're mentioning, like not thinking far into the future and trying out new things. And so Ghayda, I'd turn it over to you, and kind of would be curious to hear from your perspective, from a research and a practitioner perspective. Do some of those challenges reflect what is often seen among youth or young people that do get involved with extremist groups? And also in line with that, do you think there are things that can be done, maybe with a particular focus on the education system, to prevent or address some of those challenges or risk factors early on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do agree with Brad saying that there is no one trajectory, there is no one profile. But Brad, you're highlighting the issue of trauma, the issue of lacking support in order to pass through difficult life circumstances, be it family or lacking support from significant others, identity struggles, and then finding support in other mostly gang-related activities, because I think what characterizes also the gang spirit is the fact that it has a brotherhood, it offers a feeling of belongingness that is completely not based on ethnic. Sometimes it is based on certain specific characteristics, but generally you are accepted the way you are as long as you function in this gang and belong. So there are several factors that may make youth vulnerable to violent radicalization, and less youth as well. I really would like to highlight this. We tend to focus a lot on youth, but we forget also that adults and young adults. Schools are, for me, the most precious and essential space of prevention, for a simple reason. Most kids go to school. So, school teachers, school professionals are in a very privileged position to support the resilience of children and youth from those risk factors that drive into violent radicalization. To do so, however, schools have to become and stay safe spaces where youth can express their vulnerabilities, can say politically incorrect things, can feel that these are spaces that can help them think through those difficult ideas, those difficult issues, that think through critically and not in a consensus-based manner, the social phenomena and the personal phenomena that happens in their lives. So school professionals need to be supported in developing those skills of being able to open a dialogue, and a dialogue where there's no one winning party that convinces the other, but rather where everybody can share point of views and present ideas that offers a safe space to uphold the protective factors for children. And that also prepares youth to understand and to deal with diversity. I think we often talk about diversity as something that is very rich for the Canadian society, but we do forget that diversity for certain people is very difficult to deal with. It's difficult to navigate interacting with so many different kids and so many different families and so many different values. And unfortunately, sometimes in schools, we do not equip youth enough, and I have to say staff, to deal with this diversity issue.
If I could add something in there that I don't often talk about this, but when we talk about schools and diversity and things like that, a sort of counterpoint that comes up in my journey is that when I was in middle school, the middle school that I was at was predominantly sort of upper socioeconomic class, what happened to be mostly Jewish students. So that left many Black students, Catholic, those small, diverse other groups that were there to figure out their own way in navigating in a different way. And I myself didn't get in trouble for doing things that were sort of targeted against at that time the main population, which was the Jewish kids. But I know there were kids that were feeling disenfranchised and feeling that they didn't fit there. And that sort of group, I ended up in a very sort of ethnically diverse group of kids hanging out with, because we wanted to create our own thing that we weren't seen as outsiders. We were all the outsiders were together, and it was obviously on my trajectory that piece gave me a reminder that we're stronger together. That now I can learn from where I was at then. But it's you know, there is disconnects where we don't assume there are disconnects. So we've got to have an open mind to think about, you know, where we're at, things like that. I know in my daughter's circumstance in her school that it's been the same way. It's been hard with social in-groups and trying to fit in, and it doesn't matter where you are, it's always going to happen. So we've really got to work on having an open mind and trying to figure out you know, from a school perspective, what those groups are, and be there to help the different kids navigate these ways, because this is that pre-primary prevention that we sometimes talk about, right? Having these tough conversations early on, so that we don't have to have them later and have stories like mine. So
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think, yeah, I mean, Ghayda, you said it perfectly in terms of the role that schools can play for that, like pre-primary prevention, Brad, like you were using. I think that's such a good way to put it, in terms of preventing that kind of involvement ever actually happens. Which is kind of a perfect segue into the second piece that I wanted to maybe focus on a little bit. And it is kind of that moment of recruitment and becoming involved with the movement, Brad. And was wondering if you could provide a bit of an overview of, I'll call it the recruitment process. So, you know, what kind of, do they target a certain grievance? What was in it for you in terms of becoming involved with a group like that? And then could you talk a little bit about your experience within the movement? So what motivations really did it kind of fulfill during that piece of your experience?
sure, yeah, I mean, the recruitment piece is interesting in the sense I find all of these the stories from formers to be interesting about how they became involved. But I mean, again, throughout my teenage years, I was not part of just a white group. It was a very mixed group of kids, and I had a lot of different friends from all around, and different communities in Toronto. But it was from my earlier days. I knew this guy from when I was going to raves and hanging out in the streets and selling drugs and things like that. I had run into him at a pub, and he was this was probably 4 or 5 years later from when I initially met him, and now he had changed his look. He had a shaved head now. He had a bomber jacket on. He looked very much like a skinhead. And I knew the guy, so I approached him and I said, hey, you know, we started talking. And so we already had that, when we talk about social bonding, we already had that awkward first piece that was already over with. We already knew each other from around, and we already trusted each other, and trust is a huge piece. So for him to be able to just start talking to me about him being a neo-Nazi, that would not have been a scenario that I probably would have accepted at this time. But because I knew him and I trusted him, and he was a guy from my neighborhood, and, you know, we had hung out and done some minor street things together, so we had that feeling right there. So, you know, he just had a place with me where I could sit down and have a beer with him, and we could talk about it. But I think what he was able to pick up, and what a lot of recruiters are able to pick up in these groups, is where I was at in life. He could see where I was at, I was not happy with all the different groups that I was hanging around with, all the people that I was hanging around with. I had been in and out of jail. I had a relationship on the rocks with a woman, and that was like going out the door. So he could sense that there was things going on in my life. So he pitched to me that I should come out and hang out with some of these guys in this skinhead group with him. And, you know, at that time, that was a really, really good opportunity for me, because the prerequisites were very simple. I just had to be white. There was no other, right at that moment, there was nothing else. And I felt like I immediately belonged to this group, and belonging is very important for these groups. And he gave me that chance to come out and meet with these other guys that were going to protect me, and that I would be part of this group. And I mean, it was not well organized. It was a bunch of guys that were between the ages of sort of 18 and early 20s that were going around drinking and getting in fistfights in the street and bars and stuff like that. But it was a sort of street skinhead gang atmosphere where folks were looking out for each other, and I felt like I was part of something, but I had to detach some of the things that I noticed and I look back on now. I had to detach from some of the things that I was doing at that time. Like I listened to hip hop music. I listened to other types of music that were not okay. I had to change some of my social ties. I couldn't hang out with some of my old friends because they were either not white, or they were enemies of, they were white people, but they were in cahoots with the so-called enemies of the white power movement. So I ended up losing a lot of friends from the onset, and a girlfriend at the beginning. But I felt like I was sacrificing something for this group that I was now a part of. So that was an important dynamic to the recruitment process. Some of the things that he did and that people still do, literature was important. The early stages of the internet, this was the late 1990s, so there was early internet. There was online forums. There was different chat places where you could, find other people to hang around with, and also these mail orders were very, very important to get music and other things that were important to these violent social movements. I'll leave it at that because there's lots more, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I know how hard it probably is to kind of summarize this in a short period of time, but I think that does give a sense of how, you said it perfectly. You were going through these things. There was that initial trust, and so it makes it very easy for someone to kind of capitalize off that trust and off some of those grievances. And in line with that, Ghayda, I was wondering if, again, based on kind of your experience and some of the research, are there any other, I guess, aspects that extremist groups like this would frequently use to target people in their recruitment efforts? Are there typical kind of needs or motivations that put someone more at risk of being targeted by a recruiter, for example?
So I think I think we need to think about it as a confluence, as an intersecting point between specific needs and vulnerability, moments in a person's life, and the presence of potential recruiters who really have an array of strategies that they use and tailor and adapt to the persons they are talking to. I think the most important factors that I tend to see in the clinical practice is really the need to belong, the need to be part of a group, the need to be part of something, the need to find meaning to one's life at the moment where the person is. And this need, the search of meaning, the search of identity, the search of answers to a crisis that a person is going through, needs is often connected actually to feelings of distress, of anxiety. And these often need then somebody who's a recruiter, who offers this trust relationship, who offers this bond. And then through different means, Brad talked about music, he talked about literature, he talked about the internet. So by different means and ways, kind of gradually introduces the person to these different ideological factors that have a very specific characteristics of being, of being non-ambiguous. So what is attractive about those ideas or ideologies is the fact that they don't leave room for asking questions. They don't leave room for ambiguity. They provide total, clear, answers. And these total, very clear answers often binary, simplistic answers, well, they calm the anxiety because they provide a clear path. And there's something very important that Brad, you talked about as well, that I would like to highlight, is that part of the process is also paying something. So sacrificing something to belong to the group actually increases one's attachment to the group and makes it even harder for somebody to leave the group. Why? Well, because they have sacrificed a great deal of aspects. And so it's harder for them to go and win back the relationships that they have sacrificed, or the employment or the income that they have sacrificed. But also humans are made in such a way that suddenly when we put an effort into something, or when we sacrifice for it, it becomes more important. It gives it a bigger importance in our eyes. You know, it's worth the sacrifice, right? We often hear this expression. And so there are those key moments actually of entering into the group, of consolidating one's belonging to the group, and of making it harder for one to leave the group. That we have to think about it as really a trajectory, a complex and dynamic trajectory, right? And I think Brad is conveying this so eloquently and clearly.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that, Ghayda. And I think that piece around how it makes it, when you sacrifice something, it makes it seem more important and harder to kind of leave, is actually, it's really interesting, and it makes a lot of sense, because I think we can all relate to that in a way where, you know, whatever part of our life it is, when we do sacrifice something, we can kind of see how that becomes important. So I think that really resonates with, you know, with something that makes sense even outside of the context of radicalization or extremism. And that kind of leads me to the last part. And before I go into the questions, Ghayda, I know that you need to leave in a couple minutes here. So I did want to spend a moment to say thank you so much for being here and for participating. And that kind of leads us to the last piece of the session, Brad, so we've talked about how these things make it harder for someone to decide to leave and to start to question their involvement. But you actually did that. You were able to take a step back and start questioning the involvement and eventually exit that group. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what initiated your transition out of the movement, and maybe speak to some of the challenges along the way, or some of the supports that you had or wish you would have had along the way. I'd be curious to hear about that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there was, as there are many factors to why, like I said, meeting this person and getting involved, there's a lot of factors that are involved with getting out as well. And I think we use this word deradicalization in our field. I'm not so certain what that means, or what space and time that is, or what I haven't seen. I don't know, Ghayda, maybe that's more for you. I haven't seen many studies on longitudinal deradicalization, like broad, big studies. That would be super interesting. Maybe something to do with formers, but who knows? It's for me in my world, it was the first things that sort of came up were during the movement, because of my previous lifestyle of being around all sorts of ethnicities, growing up in Toronto, growing up in spaces where I had friends from all different communities. I had the same community kind of at work. So I worked at an international airport with all these different people who I considered to be my friends. I worked in the public security field for a long time, where I would say the majority of people would not identify as white people that I was working with and that I was friends with at work. But then outside of work, I would go home and I would be in this world of white supremacy, white nationalism, all of this stuff. So I had this connection to broader communities in the world. So I would often question, like, what am I doing? How am I believing these things when I know a lot of this stuff is not even true? in the slightest. However, it was that attachment that was keeping me there. It was the patch. I would end up joining this group called Volksfront. It was framed like a biker group where you have a patch and you know, that's your life. That's what you protect with your life. That's what you represent. Every day you leave your house, you represent that patch and nothing else, right? But secretly, I'm at work hanging out with Black folks and being this other person. But all my guys in these groups, they think I'm just going to work, and I'm, I wasn't respecting those people or whatever it was, whatever their perception of it was. But for me, I just, a lot of the ideology was just not in line with what, they weren't following what they were saying. I found that there was folks in there that were saying, on one hand, they were white supremacists, and then they were married to an Indigenous woman, or have biracial kids, and I'm like, looking at this going, how are we, because I knew in my own life I was going through these same sorts of things. So how was this even a real thing? And then some of the other things, the way that particularly the American groups were treating women. I had become involved in a relationship with the person who's now my wife, and I couldn't imagine treating my wife in such ways. Like these folks were treating women like property. My wife started to notice these types of things. She started to point out all of the downfalls of these groups and how they were not what they were saying they were. So it was a definite collection of all this stuff building up over time. From about 2008 until I left in 2011, all of this stuff was, reeling, and I was just not, I was not part of the movement as I was at the beginning. And it took, I guess, a final ultimatum from my wife, where she had just taken the jacket with that sacred patch, or whatever you want to call it, and put it out onto our table. And at that time I had one child, and we were prepping for the arrival of our next one. And she just said, look, it's going to be this movement, this, whatever this is, or us. So I at that point I had no choice but to leave these groups. I made the calls that I had to do, which that was a definitive challenge. As we talk about leaving something behind, leaving the patch, leaving that lifestyle behind, it wasn't just like leaving racism behind or leaving that. It's like, this was a whole lifestyle for 13 years. Like, this was a whole, everything that was woven into my life was related to this. So there was some challenges to come to. There was legal issues. There was, after I left, there was, we often talk about the challenges that people face when they leave. There was about 4 years of time where it was just, a void of me trying to figure out how to reconnect with society. How do you do that? And without my wife there and some of the other things, I plotted out school as a huge factor of helping me get out. I went back to finish a degree in criminology. So getting back attached to society and the community at large in some way or shape or form is always a plus. It was tough looking for work because I was a known person in these groups as well. So those decisions, they come with a lot of psychological repercussions as well. Like, just saying, giving the figurative finger to everybody that you knew in your life. These people aren't nice people. They weren't like, okay, thanks a lot, have a good life. So there was a lot of struggles with trying to be safe. I had to physically move a number of times. So this is, I guess this is my shameless pitch for programming that we need for for when people are leaving, because it's a long process. It's not as simple as people just leave one day and they're gone. They may need access to resources in their communities, whether it's for addiction or basic needs, trying to find housing, trying to find work, all of those things. And then downstream a little further, then we can start working on the ideology and the actual de-radicalization after we're done with the people disengaging. And that's where I think disengagement is, that's what I've just sort of described. The process of disengaging away from these groups is often very complicated and can be high risk scenarios too, for depending on what groups these folks are involved in. And in my case, it was definitely a scenario where there was a lot of different help that I found, and I encourage folks, if they're in groups right now looking for a way out, that's there is help there. So
yeah, thank you for that. And I kind of want to piggyback off of that, and Ghayda, ask you, do you know of any additional supports or programs or interventions that can support that kind of that process after someone starts to question and wants to move away from a group like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, really, Brad, it's amazing every time I listen to you. And I think that you have so well described the long process. It's a process, you know, of stepping out, exiting, derad, disengagement, whatever words we put on them. And the people who are in that process really go through a lot of systemic barriers, a lot of social, economic, psychological barriers, and Brad has really very described it well. Across Canada now, there are teams that work in this space, as well as some US, Canada organizations such as Life After Hate, for example. Brad himself is part of OPV. I work in the Montreal Clinical Polarization teams. We have ETA in Toronto. So every big city now has a team that is a specialized team in working in prevention and intervention in the violent extremism space. And I do strongly recommend to everybody who's worried or just want to get training or want to know more or want to, you know, learn about prevention programs in the schools, or are more worried significantly about somebody and want to refer, to get in touch with those teams. Andre, you can share CPN-PREV's website. People can look in the map and then they can identify, you know, the map shows the different resources that are available. If they know of resources as well, they are more than welcome to share these resources with us so that we can put it in the interactive map. I really think it's important to reach out for help and support with teams. Like, don't necessarily seek help and support on recipes on the internet. You really need to communicate with people who have had some experience in the process and who can try now to support and think through the resources that can be put in place to support individuals, or even to do primary prevention initiatives in the schools while we wait that hopefully diversity, equity be part of the curriculum in schools.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And yes, for everyone that's on the call, if anyone does have resources or programs or organizations that they would like to share, please do. We will have a follow-up email going out with some of those resources as well. So on that note, that kind of brings us through those three key phases, right? So the pre, I guess, involvement, the during, and then the after, and some of the challenges that come with that. Before we wrap up and go to the break, Brad, I wanted to give you kind of a last opportunity looking back at the entire journey. Is there anything else you want to mention, that you want to bring up in terms of potential solutions as well, that you would like to put out there to the group before we wrap up?
I think just adding in that Ghayda will probably hopefully agree with me here, but that there's no sorry, excuse me, there's no certain like person or persons that become involved in these groups. And I know it's hard for us as people to understand that, like, it isn't just like these guys with these risk factors. There's lots of different things that can, people can be persuaded to get involved in these groups too. There's all sorts of different types of extremist groups out there too. So I think in the sense of education, those can be super helpful for identifiers, like Ghayda was saying about trainings and things like that. We can do so much more when we all have the tools in the toolkit to deal with this, and not like have this like thought out there, oh, it's this big nasty radicalization terrorism thing. Well, if we can start talking about these things and saying these words out loud and being comfortable with these conversations and these dialogues, in multiple sectors. We always talk about the multi-sectoral approach. I mean, it's so important that we all work together to try to look at these issues. And I'm just glad to see there's more and more people every time I come out to these things that are interested in studying it or being part of it, and that's great. So thanks again for having me in here.
We're pleased to present a panel presentation focusing on practical implications and lessons learned from practitioners working in the field of radicalization prevention within school settings. So we're very fortunate today to have Dr. John McCoy as the moderator for the panel. So he is the Executive Director of the Organization for the Prevention of Violence, or OPV, which is engaged with the countering violent extremism in Western Canada. John is also an expert in counter-extremism and terrorism, and has worked as an international consultant in the United States, the Middle East, Europe, and the Caribbean. He also has 9 years of experience as a post-secondary instructor at the University of Alberta. And John is a senior research affiliate at the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society, and has more than 40 publications on the subjects of violent extremism and integration, including op-eds, policy papers, academic articles, and books. So John, thank you so much for being here. Welcome, and I will now hand things over to you to introduce the panelists.
Thank you very much, Katie, and it's great to be here and to see some familiar names in the chat. So I guess I'll talk just a little bit about this area of work and addressing polarization and radicalization in schools. I think it's so important in the work that Christina, Dimitri, and Lisa are doing is really at the forefront of where we need to address these issues in what I would refer to as the upstream space. And I think in part I'm so engaged with these issues because we've just finished off at the OPV a couple of research projects that have returned some very interesting results. So for example, we surveyed 859 students at secondary schools in Edmonton and Calgary in Alberta, and found that more than 85% had encountered hateful content, or what they consider to be hateful content, and 72% what they identified as extremist content. So that is something that's very concerning to me, and I think it's in part a reflection of the level of polarization we're seeing in Canadian society, and some of the narratives, the misinformation that people are consistently faced with online, and some of that being expressed now in protest movements. So the other research project that we conducted, for example, and just really quickly, what I see as polarization is an in-group, out-group dynamic in which an out-group is framed in some negative way based on their perceived characteristics. And then when you start to build in themes of crisis around that and dehumanization, then we're heading towards the radicalization part. Then we're heading towards the promotion of violence. So we asked 1,200 Canadians, did they think there was a crisis in Canadian society that represented a threat to our cohesion? 49% said yes. And this is previous to the trucker convoy protest. I think that's a startling number. The follow-up question was, do you believe violence is necessary to address this crisis? To which 10% of that sample group said yes. So this is something we need to pay attention to. And ultimately, I think the answers to this lay upstream, they lay in the education system. And that's why I'm really excited
Great, thanks so much. I will just share my screen in a second. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. So yeah, thanks so much, John. And I do want to thank CMNCP for inviting us to participate, and especially to Audrey and Katie for organizing this. So as John mentioned, my name's Dimitri. I'm here with my colleague Christina Ganev. We're representing CIVIX. CIVIX is an education charity dedicated to building the habits and skills of citizenship among youth through experiential learning programs used by K-12 educators. So our flagship program that you may have heard of is Student Vote, which is a parallel election program that coincides with general elections across Canada. But over the past few years, our focus has expanded significantly to include a deep emphasis on informed citizenship as a response to the current crisis around digital disinformation. And so this has culminated in one of our more recent programs, which is Control F, which is a 7-hour digital literacy program for students in grades 7 through 12, which we developed alongside digital literacy expert Mike Caulfield from the University of Washington. So digital literacy is, of course, this enormous umbrella term, but the Control F program focuses specifically on teaching the habits and skills required to evaluate and assess online information. So we hope to empower teachers to teach students how to distinguish between true and false information, but also, and maybe even more importantly, how to navigate all of the misleading, emotionally charged, or agenda-driven information that falls into that gray area between true and false. We've also conducted a major research project evaluating the efficacy of the program with partners from Stanford University and City University of New York, and I'll say a bit more about that research project in a bit. But typically when we talk about this work and the Control F program, we frame it in terms of its capacity to encourage informed citizenship within a democratic society. Because as young people turn to online information to help inform them and shape the decisions they make about themselves and their communities, we want to ensure that young people have the best possible tools to make the best possible decisions about what information to trust. And as we've realized, this work necessarily and increasingly needs to address topics like polarizing and radicalizing content. Right, I think we've all kind of seen articles like these with headlines like these about how media literacy or digital literacy or information literacy can help prevent radicalization or polarization. And when we hear stories like how Dylan Roof claims that he was partially radicalized by a few Google searches gone awry that led him down a path of white supremacy, it's easy to see why digital literacy is often framed as a necessary, if not completely sufficient, condition to preventing polarization and radicalization. But while there are a lot of calls for digital literacy programming as a response to a variety of problems, there's really only now emerging some consensus in terms of what form these programs should take. And even when it comes to something as seemingly narrow as source evaluation, there are a myriad proposed approaches, many of them contradictory, and some of them doing more harm than good. And we've seen this play out in practice in Canada. So earlier I mentioned CIVIX's recent evaluation of the Control F program. So to evaluate the program, we used a pre-test, post-test design with a sample of more than 2,300 students from across Canada. On each test, we asked students to evaluate a series of real-world examples and to explain why they either trusted or did not trust the information. And we wanted to have this pre-test component, not just to help measure kind of the impact of the program itself, but to also give us a sense of students' habits prior to going through the program. So in other words, the pre-test was meant to provide us with some kind of representative baseline of where Canadian students are in terms of their information evaluation skills. And the results were not encouraging. And I can go into more details later if you'd like, but this is the result that stood out most to me. So in this case, we show students the website for the American College of Pediatricians. This is a group that presents itself as a professional media organization, but is actually a fringe anti-LGBTQ advocacy group. And students at pretest, only 6% of them were able to determine that the site had an agenda at all. The vast majority of students just simply accepted it as face value as a reliable major professional medical organization. And then when students explained why they trusted the site, we saw a lot of answers like these. So one student looks at formatting and spelling and the general professionalism of the site. Another student says that, the homepage looked clean and they found information about the organization's board of directors on the about page. So that's why they trusted the site. The third student trusts it because it has a .org domain. And this is a common belief, and this common belief that, that websites ending in .org are inherently trustworthy is particularly troubling, since research conducted by the Stanford History Education Group, or SHEG, found that, many sites that have been designated as belonging to hate groups have .org URLs, yet a large number of students believe that something ending in a .org is inherently trustworthy. So what's going on, right? Why do we have this problem? So in order to figure out why students struggle to determine information, we looked really closely at what they actually did when they encountered this information. And we found that they employ faulty mental models and faulty assumptions when analyzing online information, many of which they had been explicitly taught. So as a result, young people are unable to gather enough basic contextual information to understand what it even is that they're looking at. So they mistake an agenda-driven extremist group for an independent research organization, or they mistake fabricated information for legitimate journalism. The silver lining here, if we can call it that, is that students employ a very consistent set of bad strategies. In Canada, we saw the same strategies applied across provinces, grade levels, subject areas, and these strategies are very consistent with what SHEG has found in the US. So what is it that they're doing? How can we discuss these strategies? So basically, when most people evaluate information online, they apply traditional close reading strategies, or what the Stanford History Education Group calls vertical reading. So this means that people tend to stay on a website or post, read it closely, determine whether the information seems credible to them or whether they think it's logical. They might also do things like read the about page, check to see if the URL is a .org or a .com, see if there are typos, assess whether the website looks professional. And these techniques backfired again and again. What has been shown to be much more effective than these strategies is what SHEG calls lateral reading. So that refers to applying a set of simple skills and strategies that involve getting off the page and using the rest of the web to find good journalism or fact checks, or to find necessary context to make sense of a story or source. So lateral reading is just about learning how to use the rest of the web to take our bearings before diving into new information. And so lateral reading is what underpins the Control F program's approach to digital literacy. And the results of our evaluation have been very promising so far, and suggest that we're working towards a set of best practices that may have the potential for mitigating online polarization and radicalization. So to give you a sense of some of these results, on the pretest, again, only 11% of students on average showed any evidence at all of ever leaving a page or a post. Right? This is just something that most people don't do. But on post-test, this increased by 48 percentage points. And then more importantly, we also saw evidence that lateral reading help students make sense of sources and claims. So on pretest, just 9% of students on average cited any kind of relevant contextual information to help justify their answer. The vast majority cited the type of superficial, had the type of superficial responses I discussed earlier. But on post-test, a full 50% now were kind of at least mobilizing information that was relevant to help justify their responses. And students who went through the program also performed significantly better than a control group that barely showed any improvement. And to put this into even more concrete terms, on a delayed post-test taken 6 weeks following the Control F program, nearly 50% of students were able to determine the agenda of an anti-vax group that presented itself as an independent research organization. And recall that right on the pretest, only 6% of students were able to do this kind of task. So there's still a lot of work to be done to study the long-term effects of these digital literacy skills and the impact on behavior outside of a classroom setting. But teacher responses such as this one suggest that the program might be promising for the purposes of primary prevention against polarization and radicalization. We heard from a number of teachers that going through the program, they saw kind of got their students outside of certain rabbit holes that they were falling into. And with that, I want to turn over to Christina, who can speak more specifically to program implementation and her experience using Control F in the classroom.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers, Katie, Audrey, and thank you to John. Thank you, Dimitri. As John mentioned, I was a secondary classroom teacher of English in a variety of social science courses, including civics and Canadian history, primarily for over 18 years. I also worked as a consultant supporting other educators in my school board, the Toronto District School Board. I used many of our programs and advised civics as a classroom teacher for nearly a decade before joining civics in my current role. As Dimitri mentioned, the goal of our programs, including Control F, is to support educators in helping students become responsible and informed citizens. And our signature program, Student Vote, is what most teachers associate with civics. So for example, in 2019, we had 1.2 million students in nearly 10,000 schools across Canada cast a ballot in a parallel federal election, and I became involved with civics using the Student Vote program in 2008. We do have an entire suite of programs, all of which support our mission of informed citizenship. So they generally go together, and educators like myself have used all of these programs in the classroom. But we're here to talk about Control F specifically. So in terms of my role, I was involved from inception to pilot in the consultation process. I used the program in 2 of my grade 10 Canadian history classes in early 2021 with great success. And I used the program in face-to-face instruction through a lockdown, through virtual teaching, and in the hybrid model where some students were at home and some were in the classroom, but we all worked together to use the program in the classroom. My students completed the entire program over the course of 2 weeks. So we recommend, and it takes most teachers typically 7 hours to use the entire program in their classes. And myself and my students, we participated in the pre, post, and post-test study. So in terms of notable outcomes, there are 4 that I'd like to speak to in the brief time that I have here, and I'm happy to follow up and take questions after. But I think for me personally, the thing that I saw through the pandemic is that most students were engaged and had a safe space to learn about information disorder and other issues they see online. Students were not having these conversations at home with their communities and with their families. And so, our classroom was the only space, unanimously, all students communicated that they were engaging in online, mis and disinformation and information disorder generally. Secondly, the program brought us together as a class community of learners converging on a common cause, digital civic literacy, particularly in teaching grade 10 Canadian history. There are a lot of topics that can be polarizing and challenging for students to come together, but the program really allowed us to come together towards a common cause, engage in civil dialogue, and work towards these skills as a class community. more specifically, I saw the same outcomes that Dimitri outlined in the research. I was part of that study. My students were part of the study. So, in terms of the acquisition of lateral reading skills, I would concur that my students experienced the same positive outcomes. But I also observed an improved quality of research when students were using online sources for other class projects. And just generally what I observed was more effective reasoning in general. Students demonstrated improved sense of self-efficacy in navigating online content, which speaks to the resiliency we want to see students develop in the face of information disorder. And finally, what I saw that was really important to this work that we are all undertaking is the trickle down or trickle up effect on families, parents, grandparents, but also in other classes. So students were taking these conversations and speaking to other teachers in the building who may not have seen Control F as a fit for their particular subject area, and really spreading these skills in maybe a passive way, but to other learners and professionals in our school building and community. So as Dimitri mentioned, this program falls into the category of primary prevention against polarization and online radicalization. And I was able to see that firsthand in my class. And the one story that I'd like to share after I'll just speak to what some of my students noted here in a survey that I administered personally. I did not edit for grammar or spelling, so excuse that. But this is very real and raw. One student remarked, "I learned a lot today. I learned what misinformation is and why it's caused. I learned what information is and what to do if you hear something that sounds wrong and how to see if it's actually fake or real news." That to me really was quite a powerful statement. I also learned not to be fooled by articles, and if I feel like it's true, I should do more research about it. So leaving the page, those lateral reading skills that we want students to have. And finally, I learned to check the news if the news is real before sharing it with others. From students. And finally, with about a minute left, one of the things that really stays with me is that we had the Toronto Public Library, biggest library in North America, do a presentation. Now Dimitri loves this story too. Do a demonstration to my class, and they were teaching the vertical reading skills. So the CRAP test, checklist test, and one of my students very politely in the chat just wrote, "I don't want to be rude, but I think you're using outdated skills. Have you heard about lateral reading? That's what we've learned through the Control F program." And that really piqued the interest of the presenter, who subsequently attended our workshops and revised their presentation to reflect current practices in terms of lateral reading and online research. So I'll leave with that. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to speak to my practice in the classroom.
Thank you so much, Christina. And that was an excellent presentation. Those pre and posts are very impressive and quite heartening to see for those of us who are concerned about the situation, particularly in schools. So kudos to the both of you for your work. And I think we can potentially leave some time for questions at the end and just switch into Lisa Kiefer's presentation, if that is okay. It's always a pleasure to see some German content. We work very closely with some partners in Germany. And so Lisa is the head of a project, CleaRTeaching, which addresses extremist attitudes in the school context. She's been doing this work since 2016, and this focuses primarily on how radicalization processes can be recognized in a school context and how one can react to them pedagogically. Prior to this work, she was with a humanitarian aid organization situated in Berlin, and there she coordinated medical projects in both Syria and Greece. Lisa has a master's degree in modern Middle Eastern studies from Leiden University, and a bachelor's degree in Islamic studies from the Free University in Berlin. And previous to all of this, she wears many hats. She's also a trained nurse and worked in a hospital for 6 months after her training. So Lisa, very happy to have you here and excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you, Audrey and Katie, for the invitation. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity, and I hope I can give you a little insight into the prevention work in German schools. It's been quite a while since I presented in English, so I will basically read out my notes. I hope this is okay for everyone. I was put my presentation. Okay, now you should see the presentation. And yeah, well, first of all, teachers and school social workers are in constant touch with their students. They exchange views, know their interests and worries. They see all the developments that students go through over the years. They are thus often also the first to notice and the first to be able to react to any problematic positions that their students have explored, including the development of Islamist or right-wing views and ideologies. Obviously, no one turns into a staunch radicalized person overnight, much less becomes an extremist suddenly. Instead, this process evolves through distinct phases and generally goes hand in hand with visible and palpable changes. Therefore, it is important to become familiar with the characteristics and vulnerabilities that may point to radicalization and violence, and the emphasis is however on may. After all, oftentimes position, modes of behavior, or symbols cannot be accurately interpreted. Among youth, adopting radical positions and categorizing people and things into right or wrong can just easily be a fad, a trendy or cool thing to do at the moment. So how can school officials approach these phenomena? Sorry. Okay, the presentation was at the end. Sorry for that. Okay, so funded by the Federal Agency for Civic Education, we started the project Clearing Process Against Radicalization in 2016. During the first 3 years, we implemented and piloted a so-called clearing process at 6 schools in Berlin and North Rhine-Westphalia. In doing so, it was particularly important for us to give teachers confidence in dealing with radical attitudes and behavior, while at the same time sensitizing them to internal factors or internal school factors that can possibly accelerate radicalization, such as discrimination. Since 2020, we have been training school officials to become, as we call them, clearing representatives, so that they can implement this work themselves in their schools. I will get back to the training later in my presentation. We work across phenomena because we believe that we can find all forms of extremism in school. Therefore, our prevention is directed against violence-oriented, inhuman and anti-democratic attitudes, statements and actions. Furthermore, we are convinced that a monothematic approach, for example, focusing exclusively on religious extremism, leads to a stigmatization of Muslim students. During these years, we experienced that these schools, in addition to implementing the clearing process, intervention process, were also thinking about their existing and missing counseling structures. We discussed these missing gaps, but also possible solutions on a broader level together with the school principals as well as the social workers at school. Reminding everyone that pedagogical resources may protect or push back against radicalization processes at the system level. In addition to the clearing process, which I will present in more detail in a moment, we also implemented primary prevention measures. These included awareness-raising events for teachers, as you can see on this picture, and workshops for students. In this picture, you can see a project that we carried out together with another organization. Using a youth cultural approach like hip-hop culture, the students talked about topics that are currently on their minds. In doing so, in most cases, topics such as homophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, or anti-Muslim racism came up and were addressed by the group in a meaningful manner. I will turn now to the clearing process, and we defined the clearing process as a term that stands for structured procedure with the aim of clarifying a certain issue, in this case, suspected radicalization. Throughout this process, transparency vis-a-vis the student and also the parents is very important. At this point, I would like to briefly mention how we look at radicalization processes in the project before I present the individual steps to you. Many factors can cause radicalization. Young people are in a phase of life that is characterized by drastic changes. Additional crises of experience of discrimination make young people particularly skeptical to radical or extremist attitudes. One could perhaps even say that adolescence itself represents a crisis. We therefore also consider radicalization as a strategy to cope with large or smaller challenges. Following a person-centered approach, we ask about the function that radicalization fulfills for students and about the issue behind the issue, like we call it. This means that we are always interested in the needs that are met by radicalization. It is important to see students as not as a threat or potential terrorists, but as individuals who are trying to find solutions and who have a lot of resources. Here you can see the 7 steps of the so-called clearing process. The process usually begins with a tip or hint, which is brought to the attention of the so-called clearing representative. And from 2016 to 2019, 19 our employees, so social workers, worked at the 6 schools as these clearing representatives, and they also had their office at the school. The first step is to assess and clarify whether it is a case of radicalization at all or what exactly has happened. For example, in what context did a statement take place? What happened before that? Have there been other situations in which a student has attracted attention? Are there any other changes in the student's behavior? Once these questions are answered, the clearing team, this is an interdisciplinary team, meets, and ideally this team is made up of the school principal, the school social worker, the class teacher, and if necessary, other stakeholders. Here, everyone is informed that there is a case. In a joint case discussion, they further assess together which questions are still open and perhaps also form initial working hypotheses about the case. In the third step, initial discussions are held with the student and the parents. The aim here is to get a holistic picture of the situation and to increase participation of the student and or family members in the intervention process. In our experience, radicalization does not happen in a vacuum. Therefore, at this point at latest, other problems such as family problems become apparent. Only based on the holistic picture can suitable educational or pedagogical measures be found. In the next step, the team meets again and discusses the picture and visualizes the student situation. Together, the team decides which measures should be implemented. Usually, this involves counseling sessions in which we work with narrative and systemic counseling methods. However, it can also be measures that reintegrate the student into the class, or measures where we work with the whole class, or measures around recreational education. Counseling sessions are also held with the parents, provided that the students are minors. We have had particularly good experience with narrative and biographical approaches. The measures are then implemented in the next step. Here, students may be very reluctant to come for counseling, for example. However, this usually becomes a voluntary offer very quickly when students realize that they are not being judged here, but rather experience an appreciative curiosity. Students who are supposedly radicalizing are often under a lot of pressure and sometimes find it very healing to simply be able to talk. After a while, the team meets again and discusses whether the measures are working or whether it is necessary to change course again or if it needs other stakeholders. The case is closed when the goals that were formulated in the team, but also with the students, have been achieved. The student leaves the school or cooperation is no longer possible, but however, these cases are very rare. I brought you some numbers from our project that we carried out from 2016 to 2019 in 6 schools. And here we had like 63 hints or tips that were reported to our clearing representatives. And as you can see, 43 of these hints concerned the phenomena of Islamism, and 20 hints were in the phenomena of right-wing extremism. And out of these 63 tips, there became 30 cases. And it's been then 19 cases in the phenomena of Islamism, Salafism, and 11 cases in the right-wing extremism. And when we started the project, we saw that there were a lot of hints or tips in the phenomena of Salafism and Islamism. And this is also because in Germany, we have like students are very much diverse vis-a-vis teachers who are often predominantly white and non-Muslims. And therefore, there are often misconceptions about religious behavior that can lead to conflicts. And you can see this in these numbers as well. So in order to implement the clearing procedure in the school, some preconditions are required. Together with the school, a cooperation agreement is signed in which the premises are recorded. These include, for example, the common concept of prevention. Here it is decided what prevention should be directed against, but also the definition of prevention goals and the establishment of the clearing team. In order to implement the procedure, all school officials must be informed and sensitized to the topic. This takes place, for example, at pedagogical days. The development of networks is indispensable for this task. It is important for schools to recognize when they need external support in a case, for example, from the Youth Welfare Office or others such as the police. The so-called accompanying measures are mainly workshops for students or school officials. Students deal primarily with civic education. These workshops serve to educate, but also to empower young people and are seen as safe spaces where we work with them and teachers are not in these workshops. Topics such as discrimination, racism, classism, and other aspects are addressed. For school officials, it is important to raise awareness for phenomena of radicalization and to find a professional and unflustered approach. In the best case, all of this should then also be anchored in a holistic prevention strategy. This includes, for example, democratic and discrimination-sensitive school development, and also to include students and parents in this process. Sorry. There was a stop. And I will talk a bit about the trainings we're carrying out since 2020. And in these trainings, we mainly focus on the expertise in the field of right-wing extremism and religious-based extremism, but also on expertise about radicalization processes. Also on a critical examination of the concept of prevention and extremism. We also talk about the legal framework of prevention in schools, such as data security, criminal law, social law, and child protection. We also address issues of group-based misanthropy, such as anti-Semitism, racism, and anti-Muslim racism, and which is a very big part in this training is the self-reflection in relation to the above topics, but also on religion and critical whiteness. We also talk about conspiracy theory. This is a topic in Germany since the pandemic. I think it's like the same in Canada. And we also focus on systemic counseling methods. And this is what I described earlier as the issue behind the issue. The training lasts a total of 6 months, during which time participants can implement the clearing process in their schools. And in addition, we accompany the participants through supervision groups and meetings. Here we also discuss initial cases in case discussions, and schools from all over Germany take part in the training, thus creating a network in which schools can exchange information and learn from others' processes. So far at this point from my side, thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to answering your questions. And for further questions, you can also email me. Thank you very much.